Peacock Angel by E.S. Drower, being some account of votaries of a secret cult and their sanctuaries. Chapter 14, The Feast, the third day. Was it nectar like this that beguiled the shepherd to dance and put it about his folds? Decritus, Edel 7. When we rose, we reminded ourselves that this was the day to which every man, woman, and child here had looked forward for a whole year, the lovely, joyful day of days, the day for which every woman for miles round had been sewing and contriving, seeing to it that each child had a new garment, getting out of the family heirlooms of jewelry and embroidery, baking festival cakes and sweetmeats, and setting out their men's gala clothes, the day which was the apogee of all the gladness of spring, the thrice desirable. We hurried to the roof as soon as we were dressed, and there, on the green hills without the village, where graves are clustered about the white bazaars, we saw Yazidi women standing by their dead, beating their breasts and faces to the rhythm of the flute and tambour. Adonis then still slept. The day of joy had dawned. But the dead were remembered, and festival cakes laid on the earth which covered them. The day, as I look back upon it, startled on this sober note and mounted in a crescendo. First religious in tone, then more and more irrepressibly joyous. The spirit of fair and festivity running higher every hour, until all was the maddest of bacchanals. We wandered out early and encountered one or two of the men we had seen within the shrine of Sheikh Mohammed on the previous night. The prayers and chanting had been kept up till past midnight and would have continued till dawn. They said, had not a sudden tempestuous wind and heavy spring rain driven the worshippers to shelter. The rooms about the shrine are small, so that it was left to only a few to continue the vigil, including the Reverend Baba Sheikh, the Awals, and the white-robed Kochek. Now, I don't think adding the S to the end is the plural in that case, but yeah. On the broad, undulating stretch, the sward which lies before the shrine, 2 shelters of goat's hair cloth, provided with benches, had been erected for protection against possible downpour. The rain clouds, however, had fled, and the sky was as blue and clear as if Sheikh Shems himself had ordered the weather. On the grassy plain and the roads along the foothills, crowds streamed to the spot. Peddlers squatted in a long double row on the way to the shrine. Before some were heaps of sweet, gaudy of hue and suggesting aniline dye. Others were vendors of nuts and dried fruits. The dried green berry of the Ghazwan tree, the terebinth, called by the Arabs batne, made brave heaps of jade. There were cheap fairings, paper masks, paper animals, toy windmills, and other small toys. There was a large round tray over which a wand like the hand of a clock swung round when tightly pushed. If it came to rest over a compartment wherein was some small cheap object, the investor of a filth or two got away with the prize. Its presiding genius kept up a call of Nasib, Nasib, the equivalent of try your luck. And Mr. Evan Guest has gave E.S. Drower its botanical name, the Pistachio mutica. The seeds are used for dye. The Ghazwan tree, the terebinth. Villagers streaming in for a feast, except for the clay buildings or stone buildings. It's hard to tell. Resembles more scenes that we see in what am I thinking? Mongolia. Gypsies, always clannish and working groups, hovered about the fast growing crowd. And what a crowd! Foolishly, I took some photographs only to regret it later, for as the day wore on, the fare grew fuller and the dresses richer. We left the hurly-burly and went to the shrine itself. The Kochek, a little paler and frailer because of his lack of sleep, was still the gentle host, but today the door was open to all, even to those of another faith. 1 or 2 benches had been placed for the effendia, as clerks and officials are called, for such were expected today from the city of Mosul. Effendia, does that come? It's like uncle, or right? These seats were ranged along the low wall which skirted the Olive Garden and filled the place which, on the previous night, had been occupied by the quals with their pipes and tambours. But what I don't like to say pagan just because they're poor or something, or a different religion. It's a little bit different than that. But what pagan spirit had usurped the shrine of the saint? Night's vigil with turbaned worshippers, its chants and its prayers might indeed have passed as the devotions of a Sufi sect, mystical and eclectic indeed, but still Muslim in outward appearance. Today the mask was awry, and I seemed to see a laughing face peering from behind it. It was a glad god, an ancient god, a young god that would dance in before long, naked and unashamed. Well, in the Bible, our naked bodies are called bashed, which means, shameful. And Islam doesn't use that. The aura, the place of light, you could say. But you can't tell a Muslim by their dress. Modesty, certain behavior, but, we took a seat on one of the benches and watched the visitors who poured into the shrine. Amongst them were Muslimin and Christians, and most of them were women. Many of them kissed the walls reverently, like the Yazidis. For blessing comes thereby, and a saint is a saint, whatever his labeled religion. The women streamed in and went up the stairway to the flat roof of the shrine. Here they sat so as to have a good view of all subsequent proceedings. The Yazidi women, with their skull caps of shining coins, turban headdresses, silver belt clasps, chains, amulets, and beads, were brilliant enough, but the Kurdish women from the villages outdazzled them. The first that we saw, a veritable Queen of Sheba, took away our breath. Bedizened as she was with precious metals, beads, and more colors in her numerous draperies than one could conceive possible, but others and more arrived, and even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of these. They were all glitter and color as they enthroned themselves on the roof, their headdresses flashing in the sun. How they must have enjoyed themselves, said A, in heaping color on color, magenta and purple with scarlet, orange or primrose with vivid green, yellows, mauves, pinks. All these colors were hurled together with a splendid audacity, with always enough black added to make the rainbow brighter by contrast. They were hung all over with large amber and colored beads, silver chains, ornaments, and amulets. Their heads were weighted with gold and silver, and the green and red kerchiefs, which composed the turban, were secured by large silver pins. A and I had hard work to preserve our good manners. We breathed to each other, "Oh, look, look," as each new arrival passed us. For in this kaleidoscope of women, each newcomer seemed more gorgeous than her sisters. As usual, many of the village women surprised us by their fairness. I noted one comely little maiden whose blonde plaits had been dyed red with henna. She wore orange garments of every shade, some light, some deep and tawny. These, together with her sun-gilded cheeks, gave her a golden look. The children were almost as joyous as their elders. The Yazidi boys, the ends of their long white sleeves knotted behind their necks, wore embroidered jackets, or if they were too poor, their mothers had sewn gay fronts to old waistcoats worn above their baggy trousers. Little girls had huge silver buckles to their belts. We went up to the roof, which was getting more crowded every moment. Some Muslim women from Mosul, all in black, like crows among birds of brilliant plumage, were perched there with the rest. I noticed that many of the Kurdish women had secured large square amulet cases to their left arms, and that silver pendants, gold coins, and tassels of many vivid colors were worn, not only on their heads, but all over their persons. Their hair was plaited, and the plaits were artificially lengthened with black sheep's wool and terminated by filigree balls on chains that reached their ankles. One or two of the prettiest girls had pinned red roses to their turbans. One handsome young creature had attired herself in canary yellow. Her mizar, or homespun toga, was dyed a deeper shade, and her other garments had stitchings and pieces of brilliant green. The mizars of many of the women, and the favorite colors for these were orange and red, were embroidered with stars and triangles. As one stood above the sitting women, the coin caps and silver ornaments on the sunny roof shone like helmets and coats of mail. We returned to the courtyard once more, the only women there, and found that a few officials and notables from Mosul had arrived, bringing with them police to keep order. There were introductions and politenesses. With their sidaras, the modern Iraqi wears a forged cap with this name, and their smart uniforms, the officials looked very impressive as they took their seats on the benches. One who talked English sat beside me and aired his proficiency in that tongue. These people, he said in a superior manner, use the Quran, but everywhere that the word shaitan occurs, they have burnt it out of their texts. So 78 verses are just those mentions. Is it 77 verses and there's 79 mentions? I forget exactly. The remark was made in no specially low voice. This man, guest of the Yazidis here, must have known that it was the bounden duty of every Yazidi who heard the forbidden word pronounced to slay him. "Oh, hush," I entreated him, horrified. "Please do not say that name here. If any of our hosts heard, they were diplomatically deaf, but I no longer wondered why they excluded strangers from their ceremonies." The great man called to one or two of the little girls and asked in a benevolent manner what their names were, if they went to school, and in what class they were. One pretty Yazidi child who admitted, after immense effort, that her name was Hamase, wore an unusual ornament upon her head, a cup-shaped gold boss as big as an egg cup, within which were turquoises and a ruby, the outside being decorated with filigree and inset turquoises. It was no doubt an heirloom. Presently there was a prolonged shrill trilling From the women outside, on the roof, and around the building, something was about to happen. We knew what to expect, for Jadon had warned us. Indeed, while wandering about outside, the two masters of today's ceremonies had been pointed out to us as they moved about in the center of a crowd and soliciting gratitudes from their admirers. These two were laymen, and their instruments were unlike those of the Quals. The drummer carried a large drum, the tabal, the piper, a wide-mouthed wooden pipe called the zernaya or zerna. The moment for their ceremony's entry had come, and the Yazidi villagers with their baggy trousers, red turbans, and fair sunburnt faces arranged themselves in ranks on the farther side of the small forecourt to the shrine, every inch of which was now thronged with onlookers, except the patch of the sward and the paved way to the tomb which bisected it. The cries increased in intensity, and in came the pair. Well, perhaps you can say the marking out of the Quran, of the word shaitan from the Quran in those verses could be, it could be, what's it called? It could be like an offering. What are they marking it with? As soon as they had entered, they fell to their knees dramatically. Or do they write out a copy leaving that part blank? As soon as they had entered, they fell to their knees dramatically, looking at the tomb shrine, and silence fell, except for the high-pitched, fluttering cry from the women above. The piper raised his pipe to his lips and blew one piercing, continuous trill. The drummer sustained a long roll as he knelt, his cheeks puffed out. Like Boreas, the piper swayed his body and piped this way and that, as if in a supreme incantation. This lasted for a full 10 minutes, a stirring, uncannily emotional 10 minutes. I was reminded somehow of the scene in the ballet Petrushka, in which the magician calls his puppets to life. Like the magician's was the swaying body, the pipe held to the lips, and the intent, commanding look. But this was no mumming. What we were witnessing here was an actual religious or magical ceremony. The spirit called up had little to do with Muhammad the Arab, or that other reverend and deceased Sheikh Muhammad, whose dust lay in the tomb. This call was addressed to the very spirit of spring. It sounded an alarum to the dead that slept in their graves, bidding them live. It summoned the land to wake and be fruitful. The rise of sap in the trees, the urge of procreation in beast and man inspired its urgency, its vehemence. As soon as they fell to their knees, the music started. So you see a guy with a horn or trumpet or something, or maybe a flute. It has a conical, it cones outwards a bit. So he's kneeling with the drum. People are standing off to the side. At last, the tense moments ended. The piper and drummer ceased, rose to their feet, and going to the shrine, kissed the outer walls, doorposts, and threshold stone before disappearing inside with the kochek. As they emerged again, a circle of men with linked arms and hands formed in the courtyard. The honor of dancing in this debka, first of all, the debkas danced in this month of spring, is auctioned and sold to the highest bidders. Dancing the debka in the courtyard of Sheikh Mohammed. Looks kind of like a stadium scene with arched entries and some pipe and drum took their stand, and the traditional music played every year at the spring festival for perhaps centuries was heard again. The debka began. It is perhaps the most exciting of all folk dances, certainly of those which I have seen. Its rhythm of stamping feet and bending bodies is irresistible. It starts stably with steps backwards and forwards, and stamping here and there, but as it continues, the leaping and swaying become more and more unrestrained. Up on the roof, the women trilled incessantly, craning for word to see, and thronging the steps. Round and round the men shuffled in the small space, the beginning of the dance outside a shrine. So we see where some of the Sufi stuff actually comes from. At last, this first semi-religious dance was ended. Well, if their intentions are religious, it's a religious dance. I'm sorry. Oh, they're having too much fun for it to be religion. No, it doesn't work that way. And the people within the shrine area swarmed out, pell-mell, through the narrow entrance to the sunshine outside, where the crowds had now swelled into a great host of people. Immediately, a new circle was formed on the sward before the shrine, the piper and drummer playing their infectious music in its center. The circle widened continually. New dancers broke the circle and linked themselves on. Groups of girls joined in as well, only the endmost linking arms with men. They were more restrained in their movements than the men, who flung their long sleeves over their shoulders as they bent and leapt backwards, for in the Syrian debka, a kerchief is flourished in the air by one of the dancers. Here, long sleeves waved aloft took the place of fluttering handkerchief. Meanwhile, the pipe and drum never flagged, but kept on, insistent and joyous, and reaching some occult nerve in body or soul that vibrated in answer. Now, they could have been using particular tones and particular patterns to create particular states. It could have been representing something, which again would have evoked a particular sort of experience. Here was the magic of the Pied Piper. I feel sure that the Pied Piper must have been followed by his partner with the drum, or the children would not have danced out behind him. The rhythm of the drum was the natural complement to his music. Fife and drum, pipe and tabor, zurna and tabal. These are twins, natural mates, bound together by ancient canon, as inseparable the one from the other as a well-wed pair. The one attunes and excites the spirit, the other impels the feet. Both must be under Taurus. Taurus, quoth Sir Andu Ogcheek. That's legs and thighs, said Sir Toby. So caper, bend, link together, and round, beat beating to the ground. The music of the pipe and drum, well, the pipe is the throat, by the way. There was a respite at noon. By noon meant midday there, right? Perhaps some fetched a little sleep after a night spent in vigil, and all ate plentifully of the meat and murgle and mince pies, which every good housewife had ready for the feast. In the earlier morning we had encountered the Baba Sheikh with his beautiful long pipe, accompanied by his son and a number of respectful followers, going to the house of our friend Sadek to repose. He did not preside at the merrymakings and dancings, called locally the Tawafif. We met him again in the afternoon at his host's house, where all the household worked untiringly to entertain a crowd of guests. On the space before the house door, there were dancers round the piper and drummer. They were hard at it again. The door stood hospitably open on the clay seats within the shadow of the archway, and around the courtyard and its garden, mats and cushions were spread, and guests took their ease, while Rashid, a tired but attentive son of the house, saw to it that all who entered were offered sweet tea in glasses, or the aromatic bitter coffee, roasted, ground, and made by his own hand, his father smoking a halaoon, and the Baba Sheikh sat together on mats, a little apart, as befitted the chief guest's status. The Baba Sheikh, drawing at his prodigious pipe, and discussing with his grave host matters affecting the welfare of the Yazidi world. Again, the Baba Sheikh wore his large white turban over his bushy eyebrows, but little gray hair showing beneath. I requested the honor of taking the photograph of both old men, and consent was graciously given. The Baba Sheikh took the opportunity to ask my advocacy in a manner which concerned the community. I had to tell him that I had no influence in such matters, but that, should it come my way to express an opinion, he would not find me slow to express my partisanship, whereat he made a courtly gesture of comprehension. After all, I was only a woman, it seemed to say. I longed to ask him to let me photograph him with that monumental pipe, but it would not have been diplomatic. And the exterior of the shrine of Sheikh Mohammed on the feast day, so the cone is obviously over the center of the center part, but the rest of the building is more over than the cone reaches up tall. And the people waiting outside, it's kind of like how you see in a masjid. Some people sit around in circles, some people back and forth, in little bits and all that stuff. Language, moreover, was an insurmountable barrier between us. A and I withdrew after a little conversation with Rashid, a conversation which threw light upon the Yazidis, to their spiritual and temporal princes respectively. To repeat it would be a breach of confidence, but it proved to me how strong are the dual loyalties with this honorable and proud people. Well, that's one of the differences. The Muslims aren't supposed to be proud. The Yazidi, they're okay with it. We left the dancing and din and the busy hospitality of Sadaq's house and wandered up the valley of Ras Al Ain, today emptied, for the fair. Here we mounted the hill of Sheikh Melke Maran and sat on the short grass, watching the Debka dancers like capering dolls below, and then gazing at the long serenity of the wide valleys, at the green tombstone hills with their white cones towards Bahseni, and the rocky mountains on our right, which hid the sacred cave. A brown-faced boy saw us and perched himself ever closer and closer, watching like a park sparrow hopeful for crumbs. He wanted to see us near too. These women with the strange customs, whose children, it was said, were cut from their bodies by magic surgery, who had machines that wrote and sewed, who were at once so friendly and so remote. We talked to him, and he told us that he was the son of Deacon Ayub, and went to school, and about his family and himself. Our consciences pricked us about Sit Gul, so we struck out across the hills to avoid returning by the village, and called at her house. She was still lying where we had left her, sick and helpless, her white turban soiled and awry on her gray head, and flies thick about her and her bedding. As usual, the family gathered on the open mud stairway that led to the platform on which she lay. It was plain that they did not consider that she was long for this world. One of her daughters-in-law said to me, if it please the Lord to call her, well, if it does not please him to call her, well also. The old lady was groaning, but roused herself and sat up and fetched out a letter, which her son Murad had sent her from his prison. Again, I promised I would do what I could to bring this hard case before the authorities. This I did, and Moslu, I talked the matter over with the Sarraj, who said the affair had passed out of his hands. In Baghdad, I tried to bring the question before the Ministry of the Interior. I could do no more, for as war clouds became blacker, I flew quickly to England to catch a glimpse, if possible, of 2 sons in the British Army. John implored me to do my best for his Sheikah, and I heard later that he had given money from his own slender store to aid in his hereditary mistress. Oh, it seems to be at about page 5s, right? These 5 dots things. It was our last evening in Bashika. On the morrow, A would return to Kirkuk, and I would set out for the Akari Mountains. After supper, we went up to our roof. The moon was bright. A soft-scented wind blew from the hills, and a torrent of black goats scuttered up the village street. In a courtyard not far off, girls were dancing and shrilling cries of joy, dancing in the mad happy circle of the Debka, their silver ornaments shining in the moonlight. They were stepping to the rhythmic clapping of the onlookers, for the piper and drummer were resting in preparation for a renewal of the revels the next day at the village of Bahseni. At midnight I woke and heard, faint but clear, the sound of distant chanting accompanied by the sacred flute and timbre of the quals. It came from the shrine. The next morning I learnt that at that hour a man had climbed the cone and attached to the golden ball at its summit scraps of votive silk to flutter there like tongues of gratitude for favors obtained of the saint. We see similar stuff in some of the Shia shrines. Amongst them, doubtless, was that green silk which told of the recovery of a sick child. Prayer, dancing, and singing had lasted all night. A somewhat jaded Rashid told us, when he came early to bid us farewell and make excuses for his father, who was still sleeping, he himself had not gone to bed for 3 nights, but he could not let us go without wishing us Godspeed. We were packing. A was loading her bedding and case onto a car bound for Kirkuk, whilst for me the police had sought out Aziz that he might convey us to Sheikh Khan, where I expected pack animals to take us on the Sheikh Ade. Aisha and her baby watched us as we packed and strapped, and Sarai appeared to bestow a last incoherent incantation. The Qawwal Rashu bade us goodbye, and other friends, including all the police and Mustafa, the sergeant, who put in the last word about his strike. A first left. I got underway a little later, leaving the car by the mill, picking my way over the stream beside the washerwomen, and walking up a grassy slope upon which blue pimpernels, wide open, proclaimed another fine day. At the top was the Ra'as's house, protected by fine iron gates, as beseemed the mayor of the place. Here more goodbyes were said and thanks offered for all the kindnesses received during our stay. The valedictory coffee was swallowed. I rejoined the car in which Jadon, Mikhail, and the melancholy Aziz awaited me, and away we went. And we find that people will use their own intentions with things. And they will also omit things. They will edit things. They will outright replace and use something else to represent that in return. But you see, in a way, the sort of thing that I do in my seasonals. is that I use verses to represent the themes. I may not accept any particular authority attributed to them, as in, oh, I'm not going to be a Christian or a Jew, or I don't accept some particular sect of Islam or something like that. And I'll tend to skip over the stuff that I don't see as supporting my beliefs, or that I don't see as representing the thing. It's like there's whole things associated with passages that it's like, that's not my point. There's something about that verse that I'm using.